Text this morning, John chapter 2, the first 11 verses. It's in your bulletin if you'd like to follow along. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother said to him, "They don't have any wine." Jesus replied, "Woman, what does that have to do with me? My time hasn't come yet." His mother told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby were 6 stone water jars used for the Jewish cleansing rituals, each able to hold about 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some from them and take it to the head waiter." And they did. The head waiter tasted the water that had become wine. He didn't know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And the head waiter called the groom, and he said, "Everyone serves the good wine first. They bring out the second-rate wine only when the guests are drinking freely. You kept the good wine until now." This was the first miraculous sign that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, a preacher was trying his best to deal with a skeptic. They had been talking and talking and talking for years. And the preacher had almost had as much as he could take. One day they were talking about miracles. And that skeptic said, "Okay, just explain to me exactly what a miracle is. If you are so big on this miracle stuff, I want you to give me a good definition of what a miracle is." With that, the preacher hauled off and kicked the man right in the shin. The man said, "I can't believe you did that." And he's touching his shin. He's trying to make it feel better. And the preacher said, "Well, did you feel that?" He said, "I did, of course." The preacher said, "Well, it would have been a miracle if you hadn't." Miracles. John only records 7 of Jesus' miracles. And John, remember, tells us his purpose for writing the book. John's purpose is that we might believe, and that we, believing, might have life. And today we see the first of John's 7 miracles. John calls them signs. What is the sign? A miracle with a message. So as we come to chapter 2, we find the first sign. A miracle with a message. And there's a message here for you and a message here for me. And I probably am talking to people today who are in need of a miracle. And I want you to know that salvation is the beginning of miracles. God's greatest miracle is taking someone who by nature is lost and dead and giving them spiritual life. Jesus said in John 10:10, "I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." That's why Jesus came. That's why Jesus died. That's why Jesus rose again, so that you might have life, and you might have life more abundantly. And salvation is not only the greatest miracle, salvation is the beginning of miracles. Because once you turn your life over to him, once he comes into your life, he begins to perform one miracle after another. Now learn this about God. God doesn't perform miracles primarily for you. but for him. That's right, for him. Look at verse 11 of our text again. The beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and the disciples believed in him. Did you see it? And manifested his glory. To reveal his glory. God performs one miracle after another, yes, for your good and for his glory. And there is good news today. God is still performing miracles. Like the old song says, have you got any rivers you think are uncrossable? Got any mountains that you just can't tunnel through? Well, God specializes in things thought impossible, and he'll do for you the things that others cannot do. So as we think about the first miracle Jesus does, I want to show you three things. First of all, we see the people who attended the wedding. Now, weddings can be a very pressure-filled event. In fact, weddings have become so expensive, it's usually the father of the groom that breaks down and weeps, and the father of the bride, because he has to pay for it. Read about a fellow in Georgia who called his local IRS office to ask if he could deduct the cost of his daughter's wedding as a total loss. Well, as we look at the guests for this particular wedding, we're told in verse 1 that on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Now, the bride is not named, the groom is not named, but they, of course, had to be there. I'm sure their families were there. After all, it was a huge celebration. And we also read in verse 1 that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there too. And maybe Mary was more than just a wedding guest. You kind of get from the passage that Mary may have even been the wedding coordinator. We'll get more about that in just a minute. But according to verse 2, not only is Mary there, but Jesus is there. And Jesus' disciples are there. Jesus was invited to be a part of their marriage. Have you invited Jesus to be a part of your marriage? Listen, you're asking for problems if you're doing the marriage thing without Jesus. If Jesus is not invited to your marriage, holy wedlock will be turned to holy deadlock. Because marriage isn't marriage until you invite Jesus to participate. Life is not life until you invite Jesus into your life. And it's no wonder so many marriages are in a mess. And no wonder so many marriages need miracles when Jesus is not invited. So we have those who were attending the wedding. And then the problem comes up. Plain and simple. They ran out of refreshments. If you've ever hosted an important reception or a dinner, you know one of your greatest fears, if it's not number one on the list, it's high up there, that you are afraid you will run out of food. Now, I said a minute ago, I think Mary was more than just a guest. I think she was the wedding planner, because as soon as they run out of wine, what does she do? She gets involved. Verse 3 tells us that they ran out of wine, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, said to Jesus, they have no more wine. Well, the celebration turned into a crisis. There was a panic at the party. I can see Mary and some of the ladies back in the kitchen trying to figure out what to do. And you know what Mary did? She took her problem to Jesus. May I ask you a question? Who do you take your problems to? Someone says, well, I take my relationship problems to a friend. I take my financial problems to a banker. I take my mental problems to a psychiatrist. Take my marriage problems to a counselor. Well, Mary took her problem to Jesus. And you know why? Because Jesus was there. And do you know why Jesus was there? Because he was invited. Had Jesus not been invited, Jesus would not have been there. Had Jesus not been there, the problem would not have been solved. Okay, you've got the people there. Mary's there. Jesus is there. His disciples are there. Then we've got the problem. They ran out of wine. Thirdly, we see the provision that astonished those at the wedding. And it's just like Jesus. I mean, there was panic and chaos at a wedding reception, and he brought out of chaos order. Just put it down. Jesus brings order out of chaos. He turns failure into success. He turns tragedy into triumph. And yes, he can turn water into wine. Well, what happened? Well, beginning in verse number 5, Mary voices a command. Look at verse 5. His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he tells you, do it." Do you need a miracle this morning? Do you know what a miracle is? Well, one day a children's Sunday school class was asked that. Mrs. Jones was the teacher, and she said, "Who can tell me what a miracle is?" Little girl raised her hand and she said, "Miss Jones, a miracle is something we can't do, but Jesus can." Well, that day Mary needed a miracle, just like some of you need a miracle. She couldn't solve this problem by herself, but she knew who could. So Mary says to the servants in verse number 5, "Whatever he says, do it." When you come to the point that you're willing to place your circumstances into the hands of Jesus, at that moment, you're on your way to a miracle. Incidentally, this is the only time in John's gospel that Mary ever says anything. Mary talks in Luke's gospel because she's talking to the angel Gabriel, she's talking to Elizabeth, she's talking to Jesus at the temple. But the last recorded words Mary ever speaks, you ought to write this down, you ought to put this deep into your heart. The last recorded words the mother of Jesus ever says is, "Do whatever he tells you to do." What good motherly advice. I wasn't smart enough to figure that out. Mr. Bevel told me that, so I'll give credit where credit's due. But the last time we find Mary ever saying anything, her message is, do whatever he tells you to do. And when you are ready to do that, when you're ready to put your circumstances, when you're ready to put your life in the hands of Jesus, your problem in the hands of Jesus, and you're ready to do what he tells you to do, then you're on the way for a miracle. Well, over in the corner, there were a bunch of water pots. Big, bulky water pots that must have been empty, and they had been used when the guests had come in for the ritual cleansing of the Jews. The Jews had this elaborate way they had to wash their hands. They even had a specific way their fingers had to be pointing when they were washing their hands. So Jesus says to the servants, he says, "You see those big water pots over there? I want you to fill them to the brim with water." Well, the servants go and do it. Well, Jesus says, "Now I want you to get some of the water out and take it to the head waiter." You see what the miracle was based on? Obedience. The obedience of the servants. Had they not been obedient to the word of God, plain and simple, there would have been no miracle. The miracle hinged on the obedience of the servants. Do you need a miracle this morning? Well, obedience to the word of God is the key. And moms and dads, if you don't teach your small children to obey authority, beginning with you, they may never learn to obey authority. They want to obey you, and they want to obey when they go to school, and they want to obey their teachers, and they want to obey the law of the land. They won't even obey God, and it's because they were never taught. Well, I can only imagine how those servants felt when they dipped some of this stuff out, and they knew it was water because that's what they had filled the jars with. They had just put the water in the jars. Nobody, as far as we know, had touched the jars. We're not told that Jesus went over there and said some magic words. We're not even told that he pointed. We don't know anything other than they put some water in there. They said, Jesus, we've done it. And he says, well, now go get it and take it to the head steward. Take it to the head waiter. Don't you know their stomach was in knots as they take this water to him? But they did. And the head waiter tastes it. And it's the best stuff he has ever tasted. Now, someone is thinking this question, so let me just answer it. Adam, do you really believe that Jesus turned water into wine? Well, I read about a man that was quizzed one day about that. Someone asked him if he really believed that stuff about Jesus turning the water into wine. This is what he said. He said, well, I've not been saved very long, and I'm not an educated man, but I know this. In my house, Jesus has turned beer into furniture. In my house, Jesus has turned whiskey into groceries, and that's a good enough miracle for me. Listen, folks, Jesus turning water into wine is no big deal for God. I mean, we're talking about God. Now, does that mean it's okay to drink wine? Well, let me tell you this. If Jesus turns your water into wine, I say drink it. I cannot tell you how many times, though, people over the years have told me that drinking alcohol is okay because Jesus turned the water into wine at the wedding of Cana. And they try to justify social drinking from the Word of God. Well, you need to know something here. You need to know that the word translated wine is a generic word. In other words, it can refer to an intoxicating drink or a drink that is not intoxicating. Now, Proverbs 22:32 says this about intoxicating drink. At the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Now, let me tell you, would Jesus serve something like that at a wedding? Friend, there is no serpent in the refreshment that Jesus serves. Verse 10 says, and they said to him, everyone at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then that which is inferior. But you've kept the good wine until now. Isn't that like Jesus? He always gives the best last. Now, the devil always gives the best first. Proverbs 20:17 says this, bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth is filled with gravel. Here's what happens. The devil comes to you with some secret sin and you drink it. And oh my, how pleasant it is to your taste. But soon, it starts getting worse, and it starts getting worse. You see, the devil saves his best for first, and then when you drink it, it turns to sorrow and grief. But Jesus gives the best last. What is the old chorus? Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. It just keeps getting better and better and better, and sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. John closes this miracle by saying this. This was the beginning of signs that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. And he manifested his glory. And what happened? The disciples believed him. Someone says, well, didn't the disciples already believe him? After all, they decided to follow him just 2 days before. Oh, they believed he was the Son of God. Just like most of you believe that Jesus was the Son of God. But seeing this miracle drove their faith deeper. You know, there are many similarities in this miracle and in your life and in my life. For instance, there were those water pots, just stone, just empty, just like there are some lives here today and some hardened hearts toward the things of God. And there's something else. The crowd was thirsty. They were enjoying themselves, but they were not satisfied. And eventually they ran out. But when Jesus is invited, Jesus invites you to be saved, and he invites you to be satisfied. And that can only happen, and that does only happen, when you really know this man called Jesus. This man called Jesus, who offers an invitation to you and to me to come, to invite him into your presence, to invite him into your life, and to let you, for the first time ever, really be satisfied. Jesus was invited into the problem. And the miracle happened because of obedience. Do you need a miracle? Do you need a miracle? It begins by inviting Jesus into your life. It continues by inviting Jesus into your problems. It even goes deeper when you are obedient. There's one more thing I want you to notice in this passage. And it begins with John's first words. What did he say? It was the third day. It was the third day. The third day, when Jesus got there, they had a problem. The third day, when Jesus got there was distress. The third day, Mary was upset. What John is pointing to is 20 chapters later, when the third day Mary goes to the tomb. When the third day, heartbroken, needing a miracle, Mary goes to the tomb. And what does she find? She finds that Jesus is still in the miracle business. Do you need a miracle? Do you need a miracle? It begins by inviting Jesus into your life. It begins by inviting Jesus into your problem. It begins by listening to his mother. You know, my granny used to always say to me, now if you don't mind, and if you don't listen, you're going to get hurt. Seems like every time I didn't mind, of course there were very few times, but every time I didn't, I ended up getting hurt. We got to listen to Jesus' mom too. And her words to you and her words to me. Do whatever he tells you to do. Do whatever he tells you to do, and you'll see miracles. Do whatever he tells you to do, and you'll see your water turn into wine. Do whatever he tells you to do, and your chaos will turn into order. Do whatever he tells you to do, and you'll experience the best. Here's the question. What's he telling you to do?